Is Romeo and Juliet actually a tragedy? In these first two acts, we see Shakespeare playing with the blocking father and the bawdy nurse. These are tropes right out of the Roman comedy. So let's look at how he builds a hybrid genre. So, when approaching Romeo and Juliet, we have, and I'm going to look at it with respect to the genres, because in many ways, Romeo and Juliet is more closely comparable to Shakespeare's romantic comedies and early writings than to his later tragedies. So it's sort of in the lyrical vein of the sonnets, as well as A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Merchant of Venice and Richard II. All of these plays are from the mid 1590s. Like those plays, it also uses a variety of rhyme schemes, and Shakespeare didn't do this too much in his later plays. There's sort of there's couplets, quatrains, octets, and even sonnets. I think the most recognizable feature of Romeo and Juliet for first-time readers is, boy, there's a lot of rhyming stuff here, and Shakespeare kind of abandoned that model later on. Um, it's arguable whether the rhyming is effective or not. It certainly is of the early Shakespeare. In some ways, it does make it does make it sweeter in some ways, but it also has a kind of there's a lot more punning, metaphor, and combating of wit, especially between Romeo and Mercutio, for example. But it just sort of shows off more of Shakespeare's poetic techniques and his sort of allegiance to Ovid and Petrarch and other writers about love. It's important that the theme of love in Romeo and Juliet is, like in Midsummer Night's Dream, momentary as a sound, swift as a shadow, short as any dream, swallowed up in darkness. So quick, bright things come to confusion, as Shakespeare puts it in Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, Shakespeare's model for Romeo and Juliet is not just about the quickness and the speed of dreamy love. It was one of his models was, and it was sort of well-known story. Well, let's take a step back. A lot of the characters of the play partly resemble the conventional character types of the Latin comic playwright Plautus or Italian neoclassical comedy. For example, the domineering father who insists that his daughter marry according to his choice, the rival wooer, the garrulous and bawdy nurse, and of course the lovers. The Italian novella, to which Shakespeare often turned for his plots, made use of the same types and paid little attention to the classical precept that protagonists in a tragic story ought to be persons of high rank who are humbled through some inner flaw, or as Aristotle puts it, amartia, mistake, which is also we tend to think of as flaw. So a lot of the easiest predecessors, the Greek romance of Ephesiaca, right? 5th century AD Greek romance. But Shakespeare's essential source is Arthur Brooke. Well, there's a French version of the play by Pierre Boistatau in 1559. Then there's Arthur Brooke's long narrative poem in English called The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet, 1562, right? And Brooke was one of Shakespeare's main sources. So Brooke's poem is sort of roughly based on the French play, which is based on the Greek romance. I mean, it's like a story that's been passed on. But I think what's more important than, obviously we're interested in Shakespeare for what makes Shakespeare great is often how he takes sources and makes them completely new and adds more depth to them. So I won't go into depth about this, but one of the things that Shakespeare really does is there's a whole idea of in Brooke's version, the action takes place in 9 months. Shakespeare moves it to less than a week. He greatly expands the role of Mercutio. He gives the nurse a warmth and humorous richness that isn't found in Brooke or in the Italian sources and French sources. He also tidies up the friar's immortality and deletes the anti-papal tone in Brooke's narrative. From Brooke, Shakespeare does inherit a cautionary narrative against unruly yielding to sexual passion, right, in the kind of vein of the Puritan preachers. But Shakespeare also sympathizes with the perils of the young lovers whose desires are unappreciated by the unfeeling world. And that's kind of like what you could say is the humanist aspect to Romeo and Juliet. And by the way, if you're curious about what I'm talking about, The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet, the narrative poem by Arthur Brooke, published in 1562. This can easily be found if you're interested to compare, and maybe we'll do a little bit of that along the way, Brooke's style of writing to Shakespeare's. But often, as with Shakespeare, he's far more interesting than his source. So we'll jump into the play, but first I just want to talk about how it's both, borrows from the comic and the tragic genre. So I use these little posters, as it were, to talk about the difference between comedy and tragedy. And usually it's quite clear in Romeo and Juliet. You'll see that there's qualities of both, right? Obviously that it is called a tragedy, but the idea of young lovers trying to get married and a father who's preventing them, or various parts of society, the Montagues and the Capulets, it very much borrows from the comedy genre. So tragedy typically tells the story of death or misery caused by a combination of bad luck and human error. So the story's protagonist or tragic hero usually possesses a kind of tragic flaw, jealousy or vengefulness, instrumental in bringing about his or her own downfall. Very often it's his, as Aristotle says, tragedy can only be about men. Aristotle calls this the mistake, hamartia. We translate this often as the Greek word hubris, or great pride. Hubris actually in ancient Greek actually means desecration of a corpse, but it was associated with great pride. Fate plays a big role in the events in Shakespeare's tragedies, and this can take the form of prophecy. Herodotus has this notion of tysis. Herodotus is a Greek historian, or retribution, that eventually comes to punish the tragic hero. There's obviously always foreshadowing and dramatic irony used to build tension. Sometimes a Greek chorus or a kind of doubling helps to foreshadow the terrible events. And in Romeo and Juliet, you have a kind of version of that with the prologue. We actually have quite literally a chorus that comes in right at the beginning. And, basically, two households, both alike in dignity in fair Verona, etc. So, borrowing right from the kind of Greek model. So examples, Romeo and Juliet, Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Coriolanus. But we'll talk a little bit about how Romeo and Juliet also, of course, borrows from the comedic. And one thing you might notice is that there isn't really a clear one single protagonist. It's not the tragedy of Romeo. Think about how weird that would be to think of it that way. It's about these lovers, the two of them. Tragedies almost always end with the death of one or more characters. As a result of witnessing these unhappy events, the audience may experience what Aristotle called a sense of relief or feeling cleansed, i.e. catharsis, which was a medical term in Aristotle which meant purgation. One purges oneself cathartically via pity and fear. But let's compare it to comedy. So comedy typically pits two people or groups of people against each other, often with humorous consequences. So although they're not always entirely funny, Shakespeare's comedies use a number of tricks to make audiences laugh, or at least giggle. Slapstick innuendo, disguises and mistaken identity. And we can really see Mercutio laying on that kind of like they're the fools, mocking, and they're sort of elaborate agons or competitions of wit between Romeo and Mercutio. The fool is also a key comedic character who acts as a sort of jester, making jokes, singing songs, and commenting on the action in a funny way. And you could say that Mercutio is a sort of possible fool. The nurse has many foolish type monologues. Feste in Twelfth Night and things like that. Or, of course, there can be fools in tragedies too, like the fool in King Lear, although the fool in King Lear is a kind of isn't that funny. That's because Shakespeare's being very clever there. But another thing about comedy that you often have is strong female characters, smart, witty, and feisty. They usually dress up as men to help themselves succeed in a world where their own power is limited, the most canonical being Viola in Twelfth Night. So Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, Much Ado, As You Like It, and The Taming of the Shrew. Love is a very important theme in Shakespeare's comedies, and the humor stems often from a couple overcoming the obstacles to be together. Comedies often end with marriage and a return to order and a sense of hope. So, what's going on in Romeo and Juliet? You have a kind of hybrid of the tragic and the comic together. In fact, in some ways, Shakespeare's using the typical setup of the comic, but then turning it into a tragedy. So we kind of have it's people say there's problem plays. I don't know if this is a problem play so much. Problem plays are like Measure for Measure, where it's unclear precisely what Shakespeare's doing. He makes the genres problematic. I think with Romeo and Juliet, he's actually creating a kind of hybrid. By understanding these comedic roots, we can see that the tragedy isn't just in the ending, but in the ways that the festive world of comedy is crushed by this feud between the two families.